Hello there, and welcome. I'm so glad you found your way here tonight. Maybe you've had a long day, or perhaps you're simply the kind of person who finds comfort in drifting off to the gentle rhythms of ancient stories. Either way, you're exactly where you need to be. Let your shoulders drop, your breathing slow, and allow yourself to simply rest as we begin. Did you know that the ancestors of whales once walked on land, their feet touching riverbanks under warm Eocene skies? Tonight we're going to drift back through 50 million years, following the gentle transformation of creatures who left the land behind and returned to the sea. In this quiet journey, you'll hear about wolf-sized swimmers, serpentine giants, and the slow unfolding of one of evolution's most remarkable stories. These aren't tales of violence or drama, but of gradual change, of bodies reshaping themselves over countless generations, of ancient oceans that cradled the very first whales. But before we jump in, if you enjoy learning about our oceans, you're welcome to let us know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see how far our stories reach. And if these quiet ocean journeys help you unwind, you're always welcome to subscribe so you can drift off with us whenever you need. Now let your body grow a little heavier as we begin. Close your eyes if you haven't already, and let's gently slip beneath the surface together, back through time, to when the oceans were young and whales were just learning to swim. 50 million years ago, the world was a different place entirely. Warmer, wetter, softer around the edges. The poles had no ice caps at all, and tropical warmth stretched far into latitudes that would one day know winter's bite and frozen seas. In this Eocene epoch, the continents were still drifting, rearranging themselves across the face of the planet, like pieces of a slow puzzle that would take millions of years to complete. The map of the world looked unfamiliar, continents positioned differently, coastlines drawn in shapes that no modern eye would recognize. Where we begin our story, a vast body of water stretched across the globe, connecting what would become the Mediterranean Sea with the distant Indian Ocean. This was the Tethys Sea, a warm, shallow ocean that cradled the emerging forms of life we now call whales. Its waters lapped against the ancient shores of what is today Pakistan, India, Egypt, and North Africa. These coastlines were lush with vegetation, dense with mangroves and river deltas that poured fresh water into the salty embrace of the sea. The rivers themselves were ancient pathways, carrying sediment and nutrients from mountains that were just beginning their long, slow rise toward the sky. The Tethys was not the deep, cold ocean we might imagine when we think of whales today. Instead, picture something gentler, warmer, more inviting. A place where sunlight penetrated to sandy bottoms dozens of meters below, where seagrass swayed in gentle currents like underwater prairies, where fish schooled in abundance, and the food chain was still finding its balance after the great extinction that had ended the age of dinosaurs millions of years before. This was a nursery, in a sense. A place where new forms of life could experiment, adapt, and transform without the pressure of entrenched competitors or established predators. The climate during the early Eocene was remarkably warm, perhaps 10 to 15 degrees warmer globally than what we experience today. Even the polar regions enjoyed temperate conditions, with forests growing where ice sheets now stand silent and cold. Palm trees grew as far north as what is now Alaska. Crocodiles basked on riverbanks in regions that today experience freezing winters. This warmth meant abundant rainfall, which in turn meant rivers carrying nutrients into coastal seas, which in turn meant rich feeding grounds for whatever creatures could learn to exploit them effectively. The oceans during this time teemed with life in ways both familiar and strange. Small fish darted through shallow lagoons, their scales catching the sunlight as they moved in synchronized schools. Larger predatory fish prowled deeper waters, their bodies streamlined for speed, their teeth sharp for catching prey. Sharks, already ancient by this time, cruised through these seas as they had for hundreds of millions of years, their design so perfect that evolution had little reason to change it. In the shallows, rays glided gracefully over sandy bottoms, stirring up small invertebrates with gentle undulations of their wing-like fins. The seafloor itself was a landscape of diversity. Corals were building reefs in warm tropical waters, creating structures that would, over millions of years, become limestone deposits hundreds of meters thick. Mollusks of every description crawled across rocks and sand, some with shells spiral and intricate, others with shells simple and smooth. Sea urchins grazed on algae, Starfish moved with patient slowness across the bottom, and everywhere in the water column itself, plankton drifted in abundance, microscopic life forms that would become the foundation of entire ecosystems. On the shorelines themselves, a different kind of drama was unfolding. Creatures were making choices, though of course they didn't know it at the time, didn't understand the implications of their behavior for the distant future. Some ancestors of seals would one day take a similar path, learning to hunt in water while still returning to land. But in this moment, in the warm shallows of the Tethys, it was the ancestors of whales who were beginning their journey back to the water, not suddenly, not dramatically. There was no single moment of decision, no conscious choice to abandon one lifestyle for another, but gradually, over generations, century after century, millennium after millennium, these creatures were drawn deeper into the embrace of the sea. The water was inviting in ways that land was not. It offered escape from predators that prowled the forests and plains, predators that were faster and more dangerous on solid ground. It offered abundant food for those who could learn to catch it, fish and mollusks and crustaceans that represented calories and protein in quantities that terrestrial prey couldn't match. It offered relief from the heat of the day, a chance to cool off, to move with less effort than walking required, to float and glide rather than trudge and climb. The water was patient, gentle, forgiving. It supported the weight of bodies that would be exhausting to carry on land. It offered 3 dimensions of movement instead of 2, and so they ventured in. These early ancestors of whales, first just their feet, wading in the shallows, cooling off in the midday heat, then deeper, swimming after fish that darted just beyond reach, then deeper still, learning to hold their breath, to open their eyes underwater, to move through this medium that was so different from air, so much denser, so much more resistant to movement, yet paradoxically so much more supportive of weight. This transformation didn't happen in one place or to one species. Various lineages of mammals were experimenting with aquatic life during this time, testing the boundaries between land and water. But one group, descended from a family of hoofed mammals more closely related to modern hippos than to anything else, would go further than the rest. They would become completely aquatic, fully committed to life in water. They would lose their legs over time, reshape their bodies beyond recognition, develop new ways of breathing and hearing and moving, and they would grow, some of them, to sizes that would dwarf even the largest dinosaurs that had ever lived. But that endpoint, those massive blue whales and humpbacks and right whales we know today, was still tens of millions of years away. In the beginning, there were only small creatures, tentatively exploring a new world, unaware that their descendants would one day rule the oceans as the largest animals ever to exist on Earth. In the beginning, there were only hesitant steps into shallow water, only curious investigations of what lay beneath the surface, only the slow accumulation of tiny adaptations that would, given enough time, completely transform these creatures and their way of life. The Tethys Sea cradled these early experiments with infinite patience. Its warm waters and rich food sources provided the perfect laboratory for evolution to work its slow magic. The environment was stable enough to allow experimentation but variable enough to reward adaptation. Creatures that could exploit new food sources thrived. Creatures that could escape predators by moving into water survived to reproduce. Creatures that could tolerate both fresh and salt water had access to more territory, more resources, more opportunities. And in the sediments of what were once the Tethys's shores, now buried beneath deserts and mountains, beneath layers of rock and sand accumulated over millions of years, the fossils of these early whales wait. They wait in the ground, preserved by accident, protected by the very sediments that buried them. They wait for erosion to expose them, for wind and rain to reveal their bones to the light of day once more. They wait for human hands to carefully excavate them, to brush away the sand and rock, to piece together their skeletons and reconstruct their lives. They wait, these ancient whales, to tell their story. And it's a story worth hearing, worth understanding, worth carrying with us as we drift off to sleep. The story of whale evolution begins, not with a whale at all, but with something that looked more like a wolf crossed with a small deer, a creature that would seem entirely out of place in water if we saw it today. This creature, which scientists named Pachytetus after the country where its fossils were first discovered back in the 1980s, lived about 50 million years ago along the rivers and estuaries of ancient Pakistan. It was roughly the size of a large dog, perhaps 1 to 2 meters long from nose to tail, with 4 well-developed legs, a long tail for balance, and fur covering its body to insulate it from temperature changes and protect its skin. If you had seen Pakitus walking along a riverbank in those ancient times, you would never have guessed that its descendants would become the ocean's giants. It looked like a land animal through and through, built for walking and running on solid ground. Its legs were positioned beneath its body, supporting its weight efficiently. Its feet had toes with small hooves at the tips, a characteristic of the ungulate group to which it belonged. Its spine curved and flexed in ways that suited terrestrial locomotion, allowing it to bound and leap if necessary. But certain features of Pakitus's skeleton hint at its future, suggest a connection to water that wasn't immediately obvious. Its ear bones in particular were unlike those of any other land mammal living at the time. They were thick, dense, and shaped in a way that would become characteristic of all cetaceans, the group that includes whales, dolphins, and porpoises. These ear bones were specialized for hearing underwater, for processing sounds in a medium where vibrations travel differently than they do in air. The presence of these specialized ear bones in a creature that otherwise looked entirely terrestrial tells us something important. Pakitus was spending significant time in the water, enough time that natural selection had already begun reshaping its anatomy to better suit this aquatic lifestyle. Its teeth tell another part of the story, add another chapter to our understanding of how this creature lived. They were sharp, conical, built for gripping slippery prey rather than chewing plant matter or crushing bones. The teeth had long roots that anchored them firmly in the jaw, and they were spaced in ways that suggest they interlocked when the mouth closed, creating a trap from which fish would find it difficult to escape. Pakitus was a carnivore, a hunter, and it was hunting in the water. Perhaps it stood in the shallows like a heron, motionless and patient, snapping at fish that swam too close. Perhaps it waded in deeper, up to its belly or shoulders, using its feet to paddle when the water became too deep for standing. Perhaps it even dove beneath the surface for short periods, paddling with its legs to chase prey into darker water where other predators couldn't follow. We can't know for certain exactly how Pakitus behaved, can't watch it move through its environment or observe its hunting strategies. But the evidence suggests an animal that was comfortable in both worlds, equally at home on land and in water, an animal that used the boundary between these two environments as others might use a fence line or a forest edge. It was exploiting an ecological niche that few other creatures had discovered, finding food and safety in the transitional zone where water meets land. Pakitus likely lived much like some modern animals that straddle this same boundary. Think of otters, which hunt fish and other aquatic prey, but return to land to rest, to groom their fur, to raise their young in dens dug into riverbanks. Or think of the water chevrotain, a small hoofed mammal from Africa that, when threatened by predators, dives into rivers and can remain submerged for several minutes, hidden beneath the surface while danger passes overhead. Pakitus was probably somewhere in this spectrum, a creature that used water as a refuge and a feeding ground, but hadn't yet committed fully to aquatic life, hadn't yet severed its connection to the land where its ancestors had lived for millions of years. Before Pakitus, there was likely another creature, one that scientists have named Indohus. This small deer-like animal lived even earlier, perhaps 55 million years ago, in the same general region that would later be home to Pakitus. Indohus provides clues about the very first steps toward an aquatic lifestyle, the earliest experiments with water that would eventually lead to whales. It wasn't itself a whale, wasn't even particularly close to being one, but it was related to the lineage that would become whales, sharing a common ancestor somewhere in the deeper past. Indohus had several features that suggest it spent time in water. Most notably, it had thick, dense bones, a feature that scientists call osteosclerosis. This bone density is unusual in terrestrial mammals, which generally benefit from lighter skeletons that make running and jumping easier. But it's common in animals that spend time in water, where dense bones act like a diver's weight belt, helping the animal stay submerged rather than bobbing back to the surface like a cork. Manatees have dense bones, hippos have dense bones, and Indohus, this small ancient ungulate, had dense bones too. Why would Indohus need this adaptation? The answer probably has to do with safety, with survival in an environment where predators were numerous and varied. When a small land-dwelling herbivore is threatened by a predator, it needs somewhere to hide, needs some way to escape. If that animal lives near water, diving beneath the surface might offer temporary refuge. a place where most land predators won't follow. The predator might wait at the water's edge for a while, patient and watchful, but eventually it will move on, seeking easier prey elsewhere. And when it does, unhurried can surface, breathe, and make its way back to land. This behavior, this use of water as refuge, might seem like a small thing, but it's the kind of behavior that can over vast spans of time lead to major evolutionary changes. Animals that are better at diving, that can stay underwater longer, that are more comfortable in water, will be more successful at escaping predators. They'll survive longer, reproduce more, pass on their water-friendly adaptations to the next generation. And over thousands of generations, over millions of years, these tiny advantages accumulate. Bodies become more streamlined. Legs become better at paddling. Lungs become more efficient at storing oxygen. Ears and eyes adapt to function underwater. And slowly, imperceptibly, a land animal that occasionally goes swimming becomes a swimming animal that occasionally comes on land, which eventually becomes a swimming animal that never comes on land at all. The transition from unhurried to Pakitus, and from Pakitus to later, more aquatic whales, wasn't a single leap but a series of small steps, each one barely noticeable in the moment, but profound when viewed across millions of years. Each generation might have been only slightly more aquatic than the last. Perhaps the young were born a bit smaller, making them easier to carry and protect in water. Perhaps the feet became slightly more webbed, with thin membranes of skin stretching between the toes, making swimming more efficient. Perhaps the tail grew a bit longer and more muscular, providing better propulsion through water. Perhaps the nostrils began to migrate backward, even by just a millimeter per generation, making it easier to breathe while floating at the surface. These changes accumulated like interest in a bank account, compounding over time until the difference between start and finish was dramatic, even revolutionary. But in any given generation, the changes would have been subtle, perhaps imperceptible. A parent and its offspring would have looked nearly identical. Even grandparent and grandchild would have been hard to distinguish. But ancestor and descendant separated by 10,000 generations, by a million years, would have looked completely different, would have had completely different lifestyles, would have been adapted to completely different environments. This process was driven by natural selection, but not in the dramatic, tooth and claw way we sometimes imagine when we hear that phrase. It wasn't about life or death struggles, desperate battles for survival. It was gentler than that, more subtle. Animals that were better swimmers could access more food, could reach fish in deeper water or catch prey that other predators couldn't reach. They could escape predators more effectively, diving beneath the surface when danger threatened. They might have been healthier on average, lived longer, had more offspring over their lifetimes. And those offspring, inheriting their parents' slightly more aquatic bodies through the mechanisms of genetics that no one at the time understood, continued the trend without conscious awareness or intentional choice. Generation after generation, millennium after millennium, the water beckoned, and these creatures answered, not because they wanted to, not because they had any grand plan or vision of the future, but simply because those that were better suited to water were more successful. And success in nature is measured by one thing only: the number of offspring you leave behind. The water-adapted individuals had more offspring. Those offspring were also water-adapted. And slowly, patiently, inevitably, the population as a whole became more and more aquatic with each passing generation. The environment they were adapting to was rich with opportunity, abundant with resources that other animals weren't exploiting. The warm Tethys Sea and its associated rivers and estuaries were full of fish, mollusks, crustaceans, and other prey that a capable swimmer could exploit. On land, competition for resources was fierce, intense, unrelenting. Many other mammals were vying for the same territories, the same food sources, the same den sites and breeding grounds. Predators were numerous, resources were limited. But in the water, there was space, there was abundance, there was opportunity. And for the ancestors of whales, there was a future that would take them in directions no other mammal had gone, to sizes no land animal could achieve, to a way of life so different from their origins that it would take scientists centuries to figure out the connection. Pakitus and its relatives were the pioneers, the first to truly commit to an aquatic lifestyle, even while keeping one foot, metaphorically speaking, on dry land. They still came on land regularly, probably to rest, to bask in the sun and dry their fur, and almost certainly to give birth to their young in the relative safety of the shore. But more and more of their lives was spent in the water, more and more of their energy was devoted to catching fish and other aquatic prey, and their bodies were beginning to reflect that choice, beginning to show the signs of adaptation that would, millions of years later, produce creatures so thoroughly aquatic that they would die if they ever came on land. The journey had begun, and there would be no turning back. The path ahead would be long, would take millions of years and countless generations, but it was a path that led inevitably toward the sea, toward complete commitment to aquatic life, toward the whales we know today. If Pakitus was a wader, tentatively exploring the boundary between land and water, then Ambulocetus was something more committed, something bolder. This remarkable creature, whose name translates directly as walking whale, lived about 50 million years ago in the same general region as Pakitus, along the ancient coastlines of what is now Pakistan and India. But Ambulocetus represents a significant step forward in the transition from land to water, a creature that had moved beyond dabbling in the shallows and was beginning to embrace a truly aquatic lifestyle. Imagine something about the size and bulk of a modern sea lion, perhaps 3 meters long from nose to tail and weighing several hundred kilograms, heavy and powerful. Its body was long and streamlined compared to its terrestrial ancestors, with a shape that spoke of swimming rather than running. Its tail was substantial, muscular, thick, with the kind of strength that could propel a large body through water, and that's exactly what it was for. Unlike Pakitus, which probably used its tail primarily for balance while walking, Ambulocetus had a tail that was becoming an organ of propulsion, a tool for swimming. Its legs were shorter than those of Pakitus, but they were far from useless. In fact, Ambulocetus had large, webbed feet that would have made it an efficient swimmer in its own right. The feet were paddle-like, with thick membranes of skin stretching between the toes, increasing their surface area and allowing them to push more water with each stroke. The animal probably swam much like modern otters do, using its hind legs and tail to push through the water in an undulating motion, creating waves of movement that passed along the length of its body and drove it forward through the water. But here's what makes Ambulocetus so fascinating, so important to our understanding of whale evolution. It could still walk on land. Not well, perhaps, not with the grace and efficiency of a purely terrestrial animal, but it could do it. The bones of its limbs and pelvis show that it retained the ability to move around on shore, to haul itself out of the water and onto solid ground. Picture a seal laboriously pulling itself onto a beach, using its front flippers to drag its body forward, its hind flippers providing secondary support. Ambulocetus likely moved in a similar way when on land, awkward and ungainly compared to its fluid grace in water, but still capable of terrestrial locomotion when necessary. This suggests that Ambulocetus was still tied to the shore in meaningful ways. It probably returned to land regularly, perhaps to rest between hunting forays, perhaps to bask in the sun and regulate its body temperature, and almost certainly to give birth to its young. Giving birth on land would have been safer than giving birth in water, would have protected vulnerable newborns from aquatic predators, and given them a chance to learn to swim before they needed to rely on that skill for survival. The skull of Ambulocetus provides more clues about its lifestyle, paints a picture of how this animal hunted and survived. Its eyes were positioned high on its head, set into the skull in a way that allowed it to see while most of its body was submerged beneath the surface. This is the hallmark of an ambush predator, an animal that lurks just beneath the waterline, nearly invisible, waiting for prey to come close. Modern crocodiles have eyes positioned this way, hippos do too, and Ambulocetus, though it was neither reptile nor modern mammal, had converged on the same solution to the same problem: how to see while remaining hidden. The jaws of Ambulocetus were powerful, built for gripping and holding rather than chewing. They were filled with sharp teeth, designed for grabbing slippery prey and not letting go. The teeth themselves were substantial, deeply rooted in the jaw, capable of withstanding significant force. When Ambulocetus closed its jaws on a fish or other prey, that animal wasn't getting away. The bite force would have been considerable, strong enough to hold on to struggling prey, even in the chaotic environment of water where everything is slippery and nothing stays still. Scientists believe Ambulocetus hunted in estuaries and coastal shallows, those transitional zones where fresh water from rivers mixes with salt water from the sea. These are rich environments, highly productive, full of nutrients carried down from the land and stirred up by tides and currents. Fish congregate in these areas. Mollusks thrive. Crustaceans scuttle across muddy bottoms, and predators that can exploit these resources have access to abundant food. The bones of Ambulocetus show something else interesting as well. Evidence that it could tolerate both freshwater and saltwater environments. The chemical signatures preserved in fossilized bone can tell us about the kind of water an animal lived in, whether it was fresh or salty. And Ambulocetus appears to have been comfortable in both, making it a versatile predator capable of hunting in rivers, estuaries, and shallow coastal seas. This versatility would have been a major advantage, would have allowed it to exploit food sources that other, more specialized predators couldn't access. Its lifestyle was probably similar, in many ways, to that of a modern crocodile. It spent much of its time in the water, floating near the surface or resting on muddy bottoms in the shallows. When prey appeared, perhaps a large fish or a smaller mammal that had come to the water's edge to drink, Ambulocetus would strike with sudden explosive speed. The attack would be swift, decisive, overwhelming. And once the prey was caught, Ambulocetus would either eat it immediately or drag it to a secluded spot to consume at leisure. After feeding, it might haul itself out onto a mudbank or sandy shore to rest and digest. It might sun itself for a while, absorbing heat from the sun to help maintain its body temperature. And when it was ready to hunt again, it would slide back into the water, graceful and efficient in that element, even if it was clumsy on land. One of the most remarkable features of Ambulocetus, beyond its body shape and lifestyle, is its inner ear. Like Pakitus before it, Ambulocetus had specialized ear bones characteristic of cetaceans, bones that were adapted for underwater hearing. But in Ambulocetus, these bones were even more specialized than in Pakitus, more highly adapted for picking up sounds in water. The animal could likely pinpoint the direction of sounds with great accuracy, using this acoustic information to locate prey even in murky water where visibility was limited to just a meter or two. This was crucial for an animal that hunted in estuaries, where sediment from rivers often clouded the water, where visibility was frequently poor. In such conditions, sight alone wouldn't be enough, but sound travels well in water, travels far and fast, and a predator that could use sound to locate prey would have a significant advantage over one that relied on sight alone. Ambulocetus had this advantage, this ability to hunt in conditions where other predators would struggle. The discovery of Ambulocetus was a landmark moment in paleontology, one of those rare finds that changes how we understand evolutionary history. When its fossils were first described in the 1990s by scientists working in Pakistan, they provided clear, unambiguous evidence of the transition between land mammals and whales. Here was an animal that was unquestionably a whale ancestor, with all the characteristic features of cetaceans in its skull and ears, yet it still had 4 functional legs. It could walk, albeit awkwardly, but it preferred to swim. It lived in water but wasn't trapped there. It was in every sense a bridge between two worlds, perfectly adapted to neither but capable of thriving in both. Imagine Ambulocetus in its element, drifting in the warm, muddy waters of an ancient estuary as the sun begins to set. The water is calm, stirred only by the gentle push and pull of tides. Mangroves line the shore, their roots extending into the water like gnarled fingers. The air is thick with humidity, heavy with the smell of salt and mud and vegetation. Ambulocetus floats with just its eyes and nostrils above the surface, patient and still. It's been in this same spot for an hour, barely moving, conserving energy while it waits. A school of large fish appears in the murky water, moving slowly toward the shallows. Ambulocetus watches, motionless, tracking them with its eyes. The fish come closer, unaware of the danger. They're searching for smaller prey themselves, focused on hunting, not on being hunted. One fish swims just a bit too close, within striking distance. In an instant, Ambulocetus explodes into motion, its powerful tail driving it forward, its jaws opening wide. The fish has no time to react. The jaws snap shut around its body, the sharp teeth piercing scales and flesh. The fish struggles briefly, but futilely. Within seconds, it's over. Ambulocetus swims to a nearby mudbank, dragging its catch. It hauls itself partway out of the water, awkward in the transition but determined. Once on the bank, it begins to feed, tearing chunks of flesh with powerful movements of its head and neck. Later, after feeding, it will rest here for a while, digesting, warming itself in the fading sunlight. And tomorrow, or perhaps later tonight, it will return to the water to hunt again. This is its life, a life balanced between two elements, between the land of its ancestors and the sea of its descendants. The environment that Ambulocetus inhabited was rich but also dangerous. Crocodiles were common in these waters, some of them quite large, measuring 6 meters or more in length. They would have been competitors and potential threats to Ambulocetus, especially to younger or smaller individuals. Large fish and early sharks also hunted in the estuaries, drawn by the same abundance of prey that attracted Ambulocetus. It wasn't an easy environment, wasn't a place where survival was guaranteed, but Ambulocetus was well equipped to handle these challenges. Its size, strength, and specialized senses made it a formidable predator in its own right. It wasn't the largest creature in its ecosystem, but it was certainly one of the most successful, one of the most well adapted to its particular niche. Over time, over the millions of years that followed, the descendants of Ambulocetus would continue to change, continue to adapt to aquatic life. Their bodies would become even more streamlined, even more efficient at moving through water. Their legs would grow smaller and less useful on land, eventually becoming so reduced that they couldn't support any weight at all. Their tails would become more powerful, developing eventually into the horizontal flukes we see in modern whales. Their nostrils would continue to migrate backward, eventually reaching the top of the head to become the blowhole. But all of that was still millions of years away, still countless generations in the future. For now, in the warm shallows of the Eocene Tethys, Ambulocetus swam and hunted and lived, a testament to the power of adaptation and the slow, patient work of evolution. It was a walking whale, a creature perfectly positioned between two worlds, showing us exactly how the transition from land to sea occurred, one small step at a time. As we move forward in time, perhaps a few million years after Ambulocetus prowled the estuaries, we encounter a family of whales that were beginning to venture into deeper, more open waters with greater confidence and frequency. These are the Protoset, and they represent another crucial step in the journey from land to sea, another milestone on the path that would eventually lead to fully aquatic whales. Among the most famous and well-studied of these is Rhodocetus, a whale that lived about 47 million years ago and shows clear, unmistakable adaptations for a more fully aquatic lifestyle. Rhodocastus was similar in overall size to Ambulocetus, perhaps 3 to 4 meters long from nose to tail, but its proportions were noticeably different, shifted in ways that speak of increased time in water and decreased time on land. Its body was sleeker, more streamlined, with less of the chunky build we see in animals that need to support their weight on legs. Its neck was shorter, compacted, the individual vertebrae fused or compressed in ways that made the head and body seem more continuous, less segmented. This is a common feature in aquatic animals, where a flexible neck isn't particularly useful and can even create drag in the water. The hind legs of Rhodocetus, while still present and still clearly visible in fossilized skeletons, were smaller than those of Ambulocetus, more reduced, less capable of bearing significant weight. The pelvis, that crucial piece of skeletal architecture that in land mammals connects the hind legs to the spine and allows weight to be transferred from legs to backbone, was becoming detached. The connection was weakening, the bones separating, a sign that these legs were losing their importance for locomotion. Rhodocetus probably couldn't walk on land anymore, at least not in any meaningful way, not with any efficiency or grace. It might have been able to drag itself a short distance if absolutely necessary, but it would have been exhausting and difficult. For all practical purposes, Rhodocetus was committed to the water. But the most revealing and significant feature of Rhodocetus, the thing that tells us most about how it lived and moved, is its tail. The vertebrae at the end of the tail, those last few bones before the skeleton ends, show evidence of powerful muscle attachments. Deep grooves and prominent ridges on the bone mark where thick, strong muscles once attached, muscles that could move the tail with considerable force. This suggests that the tail had become the primary means of propulsion, the main engine driving the animal forward through water. Unlike Ambulocetus, which probably swam using a combination of its hind feet and tail in roughly equal measure, Rhodocetus seems to have relied more heavily on undulating its entire body, moving its spine in vertical waves that passed from head to tail, generating thrust with each wave. This is significant because it's a move toward the swimming style that would characterize all later cetaceans, all modern whales and dolphins. These animals swim by moving their tails up and down, by flexing their spines in vertical arcs rather than side to side like fish do. This vertical motion is a legacy of their terrestrial heritage, a reflection of the fact that their ancestors were mammals that ran on land, bending their spines up and down as they galloped. Even after millions of years in the water, even after bodies that have been completely reshaped for aquatic life, whales still carry this signature of their past in the way they swim. The skull of Rhodoccetus shows important changes as well, changes that made life in water easier and more efficient. The nostrils, which in land mammals are at the very tip of the snout, had begun to migrate backward toward the top of the head. In Rhodoccetus, they hadn't reached the top yet, hadn't become the blowhole we see in modern whales, but they were farther back than in earlier whales like Pachycetus and Ambulocetus, positioned roughly above the level of the eyes. This backward movement of the nostrils, a process that scientists call nasal drift, is one of the defining features of whale evolution, one of the most visible signs of adaptation to aquatic life. Why is this important? Because it allowed these animals to breathe more easily at the surface without having to lift their entire head out of the water. A land mammal with nostrils at the tip of its snout would need to raise its head completely out of the water to breathe, expending energy and creating disturbance at the surface. But a whale with nostrils farther back can breathe while keeping most of its head submerged, can break the surface with just the top of its skull and take a quick breath before diving again. In modern whales, this adaptation has been taken to its logical extreme. The nostrils have migrated all the way to the top of the head, forming the blowhole that allows whales to breathe while remaining almost completely submerged, to take a breath in a fraction of a second before diving back down to depth. Rhodoccetus and its relatives, the other members of the protocetid family, were found not just in Pakistan and India, where earlier whales had been discovered, but also in Africa, in Egypt specifically, and even in North America, along what was then the eastern coastline. This geographic distribution is significant, tells us something important about the capabilities of these animals. The fact that protocetids were found in such widely separated locations suggests they were capable of traveling long distances, possibly even crossing open ocean, rather than hugging coastlines. The Tethys Sea connected many of these regions during the Eocene, providing a continuous body of water that linked Asia, Africa, and even reached around to the eastern edge of what would become North America. But the journey from South Asia to Egypt, or from either of those places to North America, would have required swimming through deep water, far from shore, far from the shallows where earlier whales had stayed. This represents a remarkable development in whale evolution. In just a few million years, in what is really a blink of an eye in geological terms, the descendants of small river-dwelling creatures like Pachycetus had become capable of crossing oceans, of swimming for days or weeks without seeing land, of hunting and surviving in the open sea. How did they make this leap? How did they go from creatures that stayed close to shore to creatures that could cross ocean basins? Part of the answer lies in their diet and hunting behavior. Protocetids were still predators, still carnivores hunting fish and probably squid and other marine creatures. As they pursued prey, they would naturally have been drawn farther and farther from shore, following schools of fish or tracking individual animals into deeper water. Over time, over many generations, natural selection would have favored individuals who were better swimmers, more efficient at catching prey in open water, more comfortable being far from the safety and familiarity of the coast. These individuals, the ones who could venture farther and hunt more successfully in deep water, would have been more successful reproductively. They would have had more offspring, and those offspring would have inherited their parents' aquatic adaptations through the mechanisms of genetic inheritance. Generation by generation, the population as a whole would have become more and more capable of living in open ocean, more and more comfortable with deep water and long distances from land. Another factor driving this evolution was probably competition and the availability of ecological niches near shore. In the shallows and estuaries where earlier whales had lived, there were many other predators competing for the same resources: crocodiles, sharks, large predatory fish, even other marine mammals. But in the open ocean, farther from shore, there was more space, less competition, more room for a new kind of predator. Protocetids that ventured into these deeper waters would have found abundant prey and fewer rivals. This ecological opportunity, this availability of an unexploited niche, would have been a powerful driver of their evolution, pulling them away from the crowded shallows and into the open sea. The fossilized remains of protocids show other adaptations for deep water life as well. subtle changes in their skeletons that speak of their changing lifestyle. Their bones were becoming less dense, lighter, less heavy than those of earlier whales. Remember that in the very first aquatic mammals, creatures like Indohues, thick dense bones had been an advantage, helping them stay submerged in shallow water. But as whales moved into deeper water, this wasn't necessary anymore. In fact, it was becoming a disadvantage. Lighter bones would be easier to carry, would require less energy to move through the water, would make long-distance swimming more efficient and less exhausting. This is another example of how evolution fine-tunes organisms to their environment, trading one adaptation for another as circumstances change. What was beneficial in one context becomes neutral or even harmful in another. Unnatural selection gradually reshapes the organism to better fit its new lifestyle. Dense bones for shallow water dwelling, light bones for deep water swimming. Each adaptation perfect for its particular environment, each a solution to a different set of challenges. The ears of protocets also continued to evolve, to become more and more specialized for life in water. They could hear well underwater, could detect sounds at considerable distances, but they were also developing the ability to isolate sound in each ear independently, to determine the direction sounds were coming from with increasing accuracy. This would have been crucial for hunting in open water, where visual cues are limited and sound is often the primary way to locate prey. A whale that could hear fish from farther away, that could determine their location more accurately, would have a significant advantage in hunting. Over millions of years, this ability would be refined even further, eventually giving rise to the sophisticated echolocation system used by modern toothed whales. But that was still far in the future. For now, in the time of the protocets, whales were just beginning to explore the possibilities of acoustic hunting, just starting to understand how sound could be used not just to hear but to see in a sense, to build a picture of their surroundings through echoes and reflections. Imagine Rhodocetus swimming through the warm waters of the ancient Tethys, far from shore, farther than any of its ancestors had ventured. The water here is different from the murky estuaries where Ambulocetus hunted. It's deeper, clearer, a beautiful blue-green that stretches in all directions as far as the eye can see. The bottom is far below, too far to be visible, lost in the deep blue darkness. Sunlight filters down from above, creating shafts of light that dance and shimmer through the water, illuminating schools of small fish that glitter like silver coins as they turn and twist in synchronized motion. Rhodhostus is hunting, moving through this underwater realm with grace and power. Its body undulates in smooth, regular waves, each movement of its spine driving it forward. The small hind legs trail behind, barely moving, contributing almost nothing to propulsion. They're vestigial now, evolutionary baggage that will take millions more years to fully disappear. But the tail, the powerful muscular tail, provides all the propulsion Rhodhostus needs. A school of larger fish appears in the distance, perhaps 50 meters away. Rhodocetus adjusts its course using its front flippers, broad paddle-like structures that once were legs but have now been transformed into steering aids. It angles downward slightly, diving to position itself below the school. Fish are easier to catch from below, where the whale is silhouetted against the dark depths rather than the bright surface. The fish are focused on their own hunting, on finding smaller prey, and they don't notice the predator rising from below until it's too late. Rhodhostus surges upward, jaws opening wide, and catches one of the fish cleanly. The others scatter in panic, disappearing in all directions, but it doesn't matter. Rhodhostus has its meal. It swims upward now, heading for the surface to breathe. Its lungs are efficient, can hold oxygen for a while, but not indefinitely. It breaks the surface smoothly, the back of its head rising just enough to expose the nostrils. It exhales forcefully, a spray of water and vapor, then inhales deeply. The whole process takes just a few seconds, and then it's gone again, diving back down, back to the depths where it feels most comfortable, most alive. When it finally rises to breathe again, it's kilometers from where it started, driven by currents and its own swimming. But it doesn't need land anymore, doesn't need a shoreline to orient itself. The ocean is its home now, vast and three-dimensional, offering freedom of movement that no land environment could match. Rhodocetus has made the transition, has crossed that invisible threshold that separates creatures that visit the water from creatures that live in it, and its descendants will go even further, will become even more perfectly adapted to this aquatic life, will grow to sizes that would be impossible on land. will evolve into the masters of the ocean we know today. By the time we reach the late Eocene, about 40 to 34 million years ago, whales had become fully marine creatures in every meaningful sense. The basilosaurids, a family that includes some of the most fascinating and dramatic prehistoric whales ever discovered, had evolved into animals that were completely at home in the ocean and utterly incapable of leaving it. These were the first truly obligate aquatic whales, creatures that would die if they were somehow stranded on land, creatures that had burned their evolutionary bridges behind them and committed entirely to life in the sea. And they would dominate the warm seas of the late Eocene for millions of years until changing climate and new competitors finally brought their reign to an end. The most famous of the basilosaurids, the one that gives the family its name and the one that captures people's imagination most powerfully, is Basilosaurus itself. This creature is so unusual, so different from what we normally think of when we imagine a whale, that when it was first discovered in the 1830s in Alabama, scientists thought it was a marine reptile, perhaps a relative of the mosasaurs that had ruled the oceans during the age of dinosaurs. They were looking at bones that were clearly from a very large marine predator, but the proportions were all wrong for a mammal, as they understood mammals at the time, and so they named it Basilosaurus, which means king lizard, a testament to their initial confusion about what they had found. Later, when more complete fossils were discovered and studied more carefully, scientists realized their mistake. Basilosaurus was no reptile. It was a mammal, specifically a whale, one of the earliest large whales that anyone had ever found. There were attempts to change the name, to rename it something more appropriate, like Sogolon, which means yolk tooth in reference to its distinctive tooth shape. But the rules of scientific nomenclature are strict and unforgiving. The first name given to an organism is the name that sticks, even if it's completely wrong, even if it causes confusion, and so Basilosaurus it remained. A whale with a name that suggests it's a reptile, carrying forever the mark of that initial misunderstanding. Basilosaurus was enormous by the standards of its time, truly massive in ways that nothing else in the Eocene ocean could match. Different species of Basilosaurus ranged from about 15 meters to perhaps 20 meters in length, with some individuals possibly reaching even longer. To put that in perspective, 20 meters is longer than most modern killer whales, longer than many of the buses you see on city streets, longer than most of the rooms in your house are wide. It was a huge animal, one of the largest predators of its time, perhaps the apex predator in the environments where it lived. But what made Basilosaurus truly distinctive, what set it apart from almost every other whale that has ever lived, was not just its size but its shape. Instead of the stocky, robust form of modern whales with their thick bodies and relatively short length, Basilosaurus was incredibly long and slender, almost serpentine in its proportions. Its body was stretched out, elongated, with a trunk that seemed to go on forever, and a relatively small head perched at one end. From a distance, swimming through the water with its body moving in sinuous curves, it might have looked less like a whale and more like an enormous sea serpent, the kind of creature that ancient sailors might have mistaken for a monster or a dragon. This unusual shape, this extreme elongation, was the result of its vertebrae, the individual bones that make up the spine. In most mammals, including most whales, these vertebrae are roughly as long as they are wide, sometimes a bit longer, sometimes a bit wider, but usually in reasonable proportion. In Basilosaurus, though, the vertebrae were extremely elongated, stretched out, so that they were much longer than they were wide, sometimes 3 times as long or even more. This gave the animal flexibility, allowed it to bend and curve its body in ways that more typical whales couldn't match. It could undulate its entire body as it swam, creating waves of motion that passed along its length from head to tail, moving through the water more like an eel than like a modern whale. The swimming style of Basilosaurus would have been mesmerizing to watch, beautiful in its own strange way. Unlike modern whales, which primarily use their tail flukes for propulsion, keeping their bodies relatively straight and using powerful up and down motions of the tail to drive themselves forward, Basilosaurus probably swam by creating waves along its entire body. The motion would have started near the head, a gentle curve to one side, and then passed down the length of the body like a wave traveling along a rope, each section of the spine bending in turn, the whole body rippling and flowing. It would have been graceful, hypnotic, almost snake-like, despite being a mammal and a whale. Despite its large size and formidable presence, Basilosaurus was not a deep-water whale, not a creature of the abyss or the open ocean. Its bones and skull structure, when examined carefully, suggest that it lived in relatively shallow coastal waters, probably no deeper than a few hundred meters, and more likely much shallower than that most of the time. The reason has to do with those hollow vertebrae, those elongated bones that gave it its distinctive shape. They were hollow, the centers filled with fluid or perhaps with fat, not solid bone, all the way through. And hollow bones, while lighter and easier to move, are vulnerable to pressure. At great depths, where the weight of thousands of meters of water presses down from above, the pressure is immense, enough to crush structures that aren't specifically designed to resist it. The hollow vertebrae of Basilosaurus would have been at risk in such conditions. The pressure at depths could have compressed them, crushed them, caused catastrophic injury, or even death. So Basilosaurus stayed near the surface, hunting in the upper layers of the ocean, in the well-lit zone where sunlight penetrated, and where most fish and other prey lived. And hunt it did. Make no mistake about that. Basilosaurus was a predator, a carnivore, equipped with powerful jaws and a truly formidable set of teeth. Its front teeth, the incisors and canines, were sharp and conical, perfect for gripping slippery prey, for holding onto fish or squid or whatever else it caught. But the back teeth, the molars and premolars, were more unusual and more interesting. They had multiple cusps, multiple points, and a blade-like shape that would have been effective at slicing through flesh and bone. Some of these back teeth were serrated, with small notches along their edges like a steak knife, making them even more effective at cutting. Fossilized stomach contents, those rare and precious finds where we can see actual remains of the animal's last meal, and tooth marks on other fossils tell us what Basilosaurus ate. Its diet was varied, opportunistic, including whatever it could catch in the waters where it lived. Large fish, certainly. Sharks, including some fairly large species, have been found in Basilosaurus' stomach contents. And other marine mammals, specifically other whales, bite marks, matching the teeth of Basilosaurus, have been found on the skulls of juvenile Dorudon, a smaller whale that lived in the same waters and at the same time. Some of these bite marks show no signs of healing, indicating that the attack was fatal, that the young Dorudon died from its wounds and probably ended up as a meal for the much larger Basilosaurus. This predator-prey relationship, this evidence of one whale hunting and eating another whale, is one of the earliest documented examples of such behavior in the fossil record. It tells us that Basilosaurus was truly an apex predator, the top of its food chain, willing and able to hunt even other predators when the opportunity arose. Nothing in its environment was safe from it. Nothing was too large or too dangerous to be considered prey. And this dominance, this position at the top of the food web, would have shaped every aspect of how Basilosaurus lived and behaved. But Basilosaurus was not just a killing machine, not just a swimming set of jaws with nothing else to its existence. It was also an animal with a complex life history, with behaviors and adaptations that tell us about more than just hunting and feeding. Fossils show, remarkably, that Basilosaurus still retained tiny hind legs, vestigial remnants of its land-dwelling ancestors that had been dead for millions of years. These legs were minuscule, truly tiny compared to the overall size of the animal. On a whale that could be 20 meters long, the hind legs might be only half a meter, maybe less, small enough that they wouldn't even be particularly noticeable if you saw the living animal. These legs were so small, so reduced, that they couldn't possibly have been used for swimming or walking or any kind of locomotion. They dangled there at the rear of the animal, vestiges of a past that was increasingly remote, evolutionary baggage that natural selection hadn't yet eliminated entirely. So what were they for? Why did Basilosaurus retain them when they served no obvious function? The best guess, the hypothesis that most paleontologists favor, is that these vestigial hind legs played a role in mating, in reproduction. They might have helped males and females position themselves during copulation, might have provided a way for males to grasp females, or for both animals to maintain contact during breeding. This is speculative, of course. We can't observe the mating behavior of extinct animals, but it's consistent with what we see in some modern animals, particularly snakes, which also have vestigial hind limbs that are used primarily or exclusively during courtship and mating. The comparison is apt, since both snakes and Basilosaurus had lost their functional hind legs but retained small remnants that served a reproductive rather than locomotory function. The skull of Basilosaurus, when we examine it carefully, tells us more about the animal and how it lived. It was primitive compared to modern whales, more similar in some ways to the skulls of land mammals than to the highly specialized skulls of living cetaceans. It had a relatively small brain for an animal of its size, suggesting that it may not have been particularly intelligent or cognitively complex. Modern whales, especially the toothed whales like dolphins and sperm whales, have large brains and exhibit complex behaviors, sophisticated social structures, advanced communication systems. Basilosaurus probably lacked all of that. Its behavior was likely simpler, more instinctive, less flexible. It probably didn't engage in the kind of cooperative hunting seen in modern killer whales. It probably didn't have the complex vocalizations and songs of humpback whales. It was likely a solitary hunter for the most part, encountering others of its kind primarily or exclusively during the breeding season. This is suggested by the fact that Basilosaurus fossils are usually found individually, not in groups, not in concentrations that would suggest social behavior or group living. Each animal hunted alone, defended its territory alone, and lived much of its life in solitude. Another interesting feature of Basilosaurus is the position of its nostrils, those external openings that connected to its respiratory system. Unlike in modern whales where the blowhole sits on top of the head between the eyes or even behind them, allowing the whale to breathe with just the very top of its skull breaking the surface, the nostrils of Basilosaurus were still relatively far forward. They were farther back than in Pachycetus or even Ambulocetus, yes, but still a significant distance from the top of the head, perhaps a third of the way back from the tip of the snout. This meant that Basilosaurus had to lift its head slightly out of the water to breathe, had to raise its snout above the surface rather than simply breaking through with the crown of its skull. It was less efficient than what we see in modern whales, less refined, but still a significant improvement over land mammals that would need to lift their entire heads out to breathe. Over millions of years, as whale evolution continued, the nostrils would migrate farther and farther back, millimeter by millimeter, generation by generation, until they finally reached their modern position. But in Basilosaurus, this process was still underway, still in progress. The animal was transitional in this sense, showing us an intermediate stage in the development of one of the whale's most characteristic features. Fossils of Basilosaurus have been found in many parts of the world, in locations that were once covered by the ancient Tethys Sea and its associated basins. In Egypt there is a remarkable site called Wadi al-Hitan, which translates to Valley of the Whales. This UNESCO World Heritage Site is one of the most important paleontological locations in the world for understanding whale evolution. In this desert valley, which 40 million years ago was the shallow, warm waters of a coastal sea, hundreds of Basilosaurus fossils have been discovered. Some are so well preserved, so complete, that you can see nearly every bone laid out in the sand in anatomical order, as if the whale had simply died and sunk to the bottom yesterday rather than 40 million years ago. These fossils are so abundant at Wadi al-Hitan that they're sometimes found eroding out of the sandstone, exposed by wind and weather, visible to anyone walking through the valley. The site has become a kind of outdoor museum, with pathways laid out between major fossil sites, with shelters built to protect the most important specimens, with interpretive signs explaining what visitors are seeing. It's a window into the past, a place where you can quite literally walk among the remains of ancient whales, where the history of whale evolution is written in stone and bone across the desert floor. In 2015, something extraordinary was discovered at Wadi al-Hitan. A team of paleontologists uncovered a complete skeleton of Basilosaurus, the first and only completely intact specimen ever found. And this skeleton included something that had never been seen before in any Basilosaurus fossil: preserved stomach contents. Inside the ribcage of this ancient whale, mixed with the sediments that had filled its body cavity after death, were the fossilized remains of its last meal. There were fish bones, identifiable to species. There were remains of sharks, and there were bones from a juvenile Dorodon, that smaller whale that shared Basilosaurus's habitat. This single specimen, this one fossil, confirmed what scientists had long suspected from bite marks and other evidence that Basilosaurus was truly an apex predator, hunting and eating anything it could catch, including other whales. Imagine Basilosaurus in that ancient ocean, in the warm waters of what would one day become Egypt, but which in the late Eocene was just a shallow tropical sea. The water is warm, almost bath-like, with temperatures perhaps around 25 or 30 degrees Celsius. It's clear enough that you can see dozens of meters in any direction, clear enough that sunlight penetrates deep, illuminating the sandy bottom and the occasional patch of seagrass or coral. Basilosaurus moves through this world like a living ribbon, its long body flexing and bending as it swims. The motion is continuous, flowing, each part of its body moving in smooth curves that propel it forward without obvious effort. It's hunting, following the scent of blood in the water, tracking a shark that has made a kill somewhere nearby. Sharks are competitors, but they're also potential prey. A shark smaller than Basilosaurus, which is most sharks given Basilosaurus's enormous size, is in danger if it attracts the whale's attention. As Basilosaurus approaches, the shark detects its presence, probably through the pressure waves created by that sinuous swimming motion. The shark flees, abandoning its meal, unwilling to risk an encounter with a much larger predator. Basilosaurus investigates the remains of the shark's kill, taking a few exploratory bites, but it's already mostly consumed. There's not enough left to be worth the effort. Basilosaurus loses interest and glides away, its serpentine form disappearing into the blue distance, flowing through the water like something from a dream. Later that day, or perhaps the next day, Basilosaurus will make its own kill, perhaps a large fish, or a smaller whale, or even another shark, if the opportunity arises. It will feed until sated, tearing chunks of flesh with powerful movements of its head, swallowing pieces whole rather than chewing them into smaller bits, and then it will rest, floating near the surface, digesting its meal over the course of hours. This is its life. This is what it means to be the apex predator of your ecosystem. Hunt, feed, rest, repeat, day after day, year after year, until finally age or injury or bad luck brings it down and its bones settle to the seafloor, to be buried and preserved, waiting for scientists millions of years in the future to dig them up and piece together the story of its life. Basilosaurus represents a peak in early whale evolution, a moment of success and dominance. It was large, powerful, widespread across tropical and subtropical seas. But it was also in many ways an evolutionary dead end, a specialized form that would not lead directly to modern whales. The Basilosaurids as a family would go extinct by the end of the Eocene, victims of changing climates, cooling seas, and perhaps competition from newer, more advanced whales that were just beginning to emerge. But before they vanished from the Earth, before the last Basilosaurus died and its lineage ended forever, they ruled the seas. They were the giants of their time, the monsters of the deep, the creatures that would have captured the imagination of any human who saw them had humans existed then. And their fossils continue to tell us the story of that reign, of that brief moment in geological time when serpentine whales swam through warm seas and nothing could challenge them. Living alongside Basilosaurus in the warm Eocene seas, sharing the same waters and often falling prey to its much larger cousin, was a smaller, stouter whale called Dorudon. While Basilosaurus gets most of the attention in popular accounts of ancient whales because of its impressive size and unusual appearance, Dorudon is actually more important to the story of whale evolution in a fundamental way. This is because Dorudon, or creatures very much like it, were close to the common ancestor of all modern whales. If you want to understand what the great-great-great-grandparent of blue whales and sperm whales and humpbacks looked like, what their body plan was, how they moved and lived, Dorudon is an excellent place to start. Dorudon was about 5 meters long from nose to tail, roughly the size of a modern beluga whale or a large dolphin, and weighed somewhere between 1 and 2 metric tons. Compared to the serpentine 20-meter length of Basilosaurus, Dorudon was compact, almost petite, with proportions that would have looked more familiar to anyone who has seen a modern dolphin or small whale. Its body plan was more typical, more representative of what would become the cetacean blueprint. The vertebrae were not elongated, but were more normally proportioned. The body was streamlined but not exaggerated. The movements through the water were probably more similar to those of living cetaceans, using the tail as the primary means of propulsion rather than undulating the entire body. Like Basilosaurus, Dorudon was fully aquatic, completely committed to life in water with no possibility of return to land. It retained tiny hind limbs, vestiges of its terrestrial ancestry, but these were completely useless for any kind of locomotion. They were small nubs of bone buried in the flesh near the tail, external only in the sense that they probably created a slight bulge in the body wall, but not projecting significantly or serving any obvious function. The pelvis, that crucial connector between hind legs and spine in land mammals, was not attached to the vertebral column at all in Dorudon. It floated free in the muscles of the abdomen, disconnected and functionless for weight bearing. This complete detachment of the pelvis is a clear signal that Dorudon could not possibly have supported its weight on land, could not have walked or even dragged itself along a beach. It was trapped in the ocean, in the best possible sense of that word, unable to leave but also supremely adapted to its aquatic home. The skull of Dorudon provides a wealth of information about how this animal lived, what it ate, how it hunted and survived in waters that also held predators much larger than itself. The skull was relatively large for the body size, taking up a significant proportion of the animal's total length. The jaws were powerful, muscular, built for generating significant bite force. They were lined with sharp teeth that came in different shapes depending on their position in the mouth, a feature scientists call heterodont dentition. The front teeth, the incisors and canines, were sharp and pointed, excellent for gripping prey, for holding on to slippery fish. The back teeth, the molars and premolars, were more complex, with multiple cusps and serrated edges, useful for processing food once it was caught, for cutting through scales and flesh. This variety in tooth shape is actually more primitive than what we see in modern toothed whales. Most modern dolphins and porpoises and sperm whales have what's called homodont dentition, meaning all their teeth are roughly the same simple peg-like shape. They don't really chew their food, don't process it in their mouths the way we do or the way many land mammals do. They grip it with their teeth and swallow it whole or in large chunks. But Dorudon still had differentiated teeth, still retained the variety that's typical of land mammals, suggesting that it might have processed its food more thoroughly, might have done at least some cutting or tearing before swallowing. Like Basilosaurus, Dorudon was a predator, a carnivore that hunted fish and probably squid and other marine creatures in the coastal waters where it lived. But unlike Basilosaurus, which was a solitary apex predator that feared nothing and hunted alone, Dorudon may have been more social, may have lived and hunted in groups. This is suggested by the fact that Dorudon fossils are often found in clusters, multiple individuals in the same area, sometimes even with individuals of different ages present. This pattern is consistent with group living, with pods or schools or whatever term we want to use for collections of related individuals moving through their environment together. Modern toothed whales are often highly social, living in pods that can number in the dozens or even hundreds of individuals in some species. They cooperate in hunting, share information about food sources, protect each other from predators, care for each other's young. It's possible, perhaps even likely, that Dorudon exhibited early versions of these behaviors, that social living in whales goes back to the very beginning of fully aquatic forms. The benefits of social living are substantial for marine predators. Groups can herd fish more effectively than individuals. Groups can defend against predators more successfully. Groups can find food more reliably and can share information about where prey is abundant. One interesting aspect of Dorudon, one feature that sets it apart from modern whales and shows that it was still relatively primitive despite its advanced aquatic adaptations, is that it couldn't echolocate. At least not in the sophisticated way that modern toothed whales do, not with the precision and range and informational richness that characterizes modern cetacean sonar. Dorudon lacked the specialized structures in the skull that are necessary for producing and receiving the high-frequency sounds used in echolocation. It didn't have the pronounced melon, that bulbous forehead full of specialized fats and oils that focuses sounds in modern dolphins. It didn't have the asymmetrical skull that's characteristic of echolocating whales. Its ears, while highly adapted for hearing underwater, didn't have all the specializations seen in modern forms. So how did Dorudon hunt in murky water, or at night, in conditions where visibility was poor or non-existent? How did it find prey when it couldn't see them and couldn't echolocate? The answer is probably a combination of good eyesight, when conditions allowed, keen hearing that could detect the sounds of fish swimming and feeding, and perhaps a sense of smell or taste that could pick up chemical cues in the water. Its ears were definitely well adapted for detecting sounds underwater, for hearing the movements of prey even at considerable distances. It could likely hear the splashes of fish at the surface, the vibrations of schools of fish moving through the water, the sounds of predators and prey going about their business. This would have allowed Dorodon to hunt effectively even when visibility was limited, relying on passive hearing rather than active echolocation. Dorodon lived in shallow coastal environments, much like Basilosaurus. The two species are found together in the fossil record, their bones mixed in the same sediments, telling us that they shared the same habitat, occupied the same general geographic range, lived their lives in proximity to each other. But we also know that this proximity wasn't always peaceful or beneficial for Dorodon. We know that Basilosaurus sometimes preyed on juvenile Dorodon, that young individuals of the smaller species fell victim to the much larger predator. Fossils of young Dorodon have been found with bite marks that match the teeth of Basilosaurus, deep wounds in the skull that show the characteristic pattern of Basilosaurus's dentition. Some of these bite marks show no signs of healing, no evidence of bone growth or repair, indicating that the attack was fatal, that the young whale died from its wounds and likely ended up in the stomach of its attacker. This predator-prey relationship is one of the earliest documented examples of one whale hunting another, of cetacean-on-cetacean violence. It tells us that the ancient oceans were dangerous places even for whales, that being a predator didn't necessarily mean being safe, that the food chain extended up and down and sideways in complex ways that aren't always obvious from the fossil record alone. But Dorodon wasn't just prey. Adult Dorodon would have been formidable animals in their own right, capable of hunting large fish and defending themselves from most threats. At 5 meters long and weighing a metric ton or more, an adult Dorodon was not something that could be easily attacked or killed. It would take an animal the size of Basilosaurus to reliably prey on adult Dorodon, and even then it might not have been worth the effort or the risk of injury. So while young Dorodon were vulnerable, the adults probably moved through their environment with relative confidence, hunting and feeding without constant fear of predation. Imagine a group of Dorodon, perhaps 6 or 8 individuals of various ages, swimming through a shallow bay in the late Eocene. The water is warm and slightly murky, full of suspended sediment from rivers that empty into the bay. The bottom is sandy, with occasional patches of seagrass waving gently in the current. The Dorodon are moving in formation, not rigidly but loosely, staying within sight and sound of each other, communicating through simple sounds, clicks and whistles that convey basic information about location and perhaps mood. They encounter a large school of fish, hundreds or thousands of individuals moving together in a synchronized mass that shifts and flows like a living cloud. The Dorodon begin to work together, not with the sophisticated coordination of modern dolphins, but with basic cooperation born of instinct and experience. They circle the school, tightening the circle, herding the fish into a dense ball. The fish panic, darting this way and that, but unable to escape the ring of predators. And then the Dorodon strike, darting in one at a time or in pairs, jaws snapping, catching fish with efficient movements. The hunt is successful. Each Dorodon catches several fish, swallowing them quickly before returning to the school for more. The feeding frenzy lasts only a few minutes, but in that time each whale consumes kilograms of fish, enough to sustain them for hours or even a day. When the school finally manages to escape, scattering into the shallows and deeper water, the Dorodon regroup and continue on their way, satisfied and unhurried. Later, they rest together at the surface, floating in the warm sun. Their breathing is not synchronized like you might see in modern whales, but they're roughly in rhythm with each other, rising to breathe at similar intervals. They're resting but also alert, aware of their surroundings, listening for danger. In these waters, danger comes in the form of Basilosaurus, and the Dorodon know to be cautious, to stay in groups where they can watch for threats and protect each other and the vulnerable young. The discovery of Dorodon and the detailed study of its fossils has been instrumental in helping scientists understand whale evolution. Unlike Basilosaurus, whose unusual body plan represents something of an evolutionary outlier, a specialized form that didn't lead directly to modern whales, Dorodon represents a more typical early whale. Its body plan, with modifications and refinements over millions of years, is the body plan that would eventually give rise to all modern cetaceans. By studying Dorodon's skeleton in detail, by examining every bone and joint and tooth, researchers can trace the changes that occurred as whales continued to adapt to life in the ocean. They can see how the hind limbs became smaller and eventually disappeared entirely except as internal vestiges. They can see how the tail developed into the powerful flukes used for propulsion in modern whales. They can see how the skull changed to accommodate a blowhole and later in other lineages, the structures needed for echolocation. One particularly well-preserved Dorodon fossil, discovered in Egypt at Wadi el-Hitan and now housed in museums and research collections, shows these features in remarkable detail. The skeleton is nearly complete, with almost every bone present and accounted for, giving researchers a clear picture of the animal's anatomy from head to tail. From this fossil and others like it, scientists can estimate how much Dorodon weighed, how fast it could swim, what its internal organs might have looked like, how it grew and developed from infant to adult. This kind of detailed information is rare in paleontology, precious beyond measure, because it allows reconstruction not just of anatomy but of behavior, lifestyle, ecology. Dorodon went extinct along with the rest of the basilosaurids at the end of the Eocene, about 34 million years ago, when a significant climate change event caused global temperatures to drop and ocean circulation patterns to shift. The reasons for the extinction of these early whales aren't entirely clear, aren't fully understood, even with all our modern scientific tools. But it probably had to do with that climate change, with the cooling of the oceans and the shrinking of the warm, shallow seas that Dorodon and Basilosaurus loved. As conditions changed, as their preferred habitat disappeared or altered beyond recognition, these early whales couldn't adapt quickly enough, couldn't find new niches, or couldn't compete with new types of whales that were better suited to the changing conditions. But even though Dorodon itself is gone, extinct for more than 30 million years, its legacy lives on. The whales that descended from creatures very much like Dorodon, whales that diverged into the two great lineages of toothed whales and baleen whales, those descendants still swim in our oceans today. Every dolphin and porpoise, every sperm whale and beaked whale, every blue whale and humpback and right whale, all of them carry within their bodies echoes of Dorodon's anatomy, hints of that ancient body plan that worked so well in the Eocene, and that, with modifications, continues to work in modern oceans. Dorodon may be dead as a species, but it lives on in its descendants, in the whales that rule the seas today. As the Eocene gave way to the Oligocene, about 34 million years ago, something momentous happened in whale evolution. The whale family tree, which until this point had been a single trunk growing upward through time, split into two main branches that persist to this day. These two branches represent fundamentally different approaches to being a whale, different ways of exploiting the resources of the ocean, different solutions to the problem of survival in a marine environment. We call these two branches the Odontocete, or toothed whales, and the Mystacete, or baleen whales. And this division, this great parting of ways, set the stage for all the incredible diversity of whales we see in modern oceans. The toothed whales, the Odontocetes, are characterized by their retention of teeth throughout life and by their eventual development of echolocation, that remarkable biological sonar system that allows them to navigate and hunt using sound instead of, or in addition to sight. This group includes dolphins and porpoises, sperm whales and beaked whales, all the whales that hunt individual prey items using active pursuit, and in most modern forms, echolocation to locate and track their targets. The evolution of echolocation in toothed whales was a game changer in every sense of that phrase. It opened up entirely new possibilities, new niches, new ways of living. It allowed these whales to exploit environments and prey that were inaccessible to other predators. Deep-diving species like sperm whales could hunt giant squid in the pitch-black depths of the ocean, thousands of meters down where no sunlight has penetrated for millions of years. Where the only light comes from bioluminescent creatures, they could navigate in that darkness, could find prey in that void, using only sound and the echoes that returned to their specialized ears. Fast-swimming dolphins could chase fish in open water, using echolocation to anticipate their prey's movements, to track them through schools of other fish, to maintain pursuit even when the prey darted and twisted and tried to escape. Even in shallow coastal waters where visibility was poor because of suspended sediment or algal blooms, toothed whales had an advantage over predators that relied on sight. They could hunt in murky water, in darkness, in conditions where visual predators would be helpless. The earliest evidence of echolocation in whales comes from fossils dating to the early Oligocene. not long after the split between toothed and baleen whales occurred. These early echolocators, creatures like Cotylocara, which lived about 28 million years ago, had skulls that were beginning to show the characteristic features of modern toothed whales. The bones of the face were becoming more asymmetrical, with one side slightly larger or differently shaped than the other, a feature related to the production and reception of echolocation clicks. The forehead was becoming more bulbous, more domed, accommodating the melon, that fatty organ that focuses and directs the sounds used in echolocation. And the inner ear, already specialized for underwater hearing, was becoming even more specialized for detecting high-frequency sounds, the ultrasonic clicks and whistles that would become the language of echolocation. Cotylocara was relatively small, about 2 to 3 meters long, roughly the size of a modern dolphin. It probably hunted fish and squid in coastal waters, using its emerging echolocation abilities to find prey in conditions where sight alone might not be sufficient. It represents an early experiment in echolocation, one of the first successful implementations of this remarkable adaptation, and that experiment would be refined over millions of years, would be elaborated and perfected, would give rise to the sophisticated sonar systems we see in modern dolphins and porpoises and beaked whales, systems so sensitive and precise that they put our best human-designed sonar to shame. While the toothed whales were developing echolocation and pursuing individual prey with increasing sophistication, the baleen whales were going in a completely different direction. Instead of hunting individual animals using sound and speed and precision, they were evolving the ability to filter enormous quantities of small prey directly from the water. This required a completely different set of adaptations, a complete reorganization of the skull and mouth, and it would ultimately lead to the evolution of the largest animals ever to exist on Earth. The earliest mystices, the earliest baleen whales, still had teeth. Creatures like Mystacodon, which lived in the late Eocene about 37 to 33 million years ago, looked superficially similar to toothed whales in many ways, but their teeth were already showing signs of being used for something other than simple biting and tearing. The teeth were more widely spaced than in typical predatory whales. The wear patterns on the teeth suggested they were being used differently, perhaps for straining or filtering rather than for puncturing and gripping. There's evidence that these early mystices were beginning to use suction feeding, a technique where the whale creates negative pressure in its mouth, essentially sucking in water and prey together in a rapid, powerful inhalation. The whale would then close its mouth and use its tongue and throat muscles to expel the water while retaining the food. This isn't filter feeding in the sense we see in modern baleen whales, but it's a step in that direction, a precursor to the elaborate filtering systems that would evolve later. This was a transitional stage, a bridge between the raptorial feeding of archaeoses like Basilosaurus, which hunted large individual prey, and the filter feeding of modern baleen whales, which strain vast quantities of tiny prey from the water. These early toothed mystices were experimenting with different feeding strategies, trying different approaches, and over time one of these strategies proved so successful that it changed the trajectory of whale evolution forever. That strategy was true filter feeding, and it required a remarkable innovation: baleen. Baleen is not made of bone or tooth material, not calcium-based like the hard parts of the skeleton. Instead, it's made of keratin, the same protein that makes up human hair and fingernails, bird feathers, and animal hooves. In baleen whales, sheets of this keratinous material grow down from the upper jaw in long plates, forming a curtain that hangs inside the mouth. The inner edges of these plates are frayed into bristles, creating a dense mat of fine fibers. When the whale takes in a mouthful of water full of krill or small fish or other prey, it closes its mouth partially and uses its enormous tongue to push the water out through the baleen. The water flows out easily, but the prey, even tiny organisms just a few millimeters long, are caught by the bristles and remain in the mouth to be swallowed. This seems simple, almost elegant in its simplicity, but the evolution of baleen was anything but simple. For a long time, decades in fact, scientists debated how it happened, how this remarkable structure evolved. Did teeth disappear first, leaving a gap that baleen then evolved to fill? Or did baleen and teeth exist together for a while, with baleen gradually taking over the role of food capture until teeth became unnecessary and disappeared? The debate was intense, informed by theory and speculation and the relatively sparse fossil record of early mysticates. Recent fossil discoveries have begun to answer these questions, have started to fill in the gaps in our understanding. One crucial fossil is Coronone havensteini, a toothed mastid from the Oligocene of South Carolina in North America. Coronone had teeth, functional teeth that were certainly used in feeding, but these weren't the simple pointed teeth of a typical predator. Instead, especially in the back of the mouth, Coronone had broad, multi-cusped teeth with spaces between them, gaps where water could flow through. It looks very much like Coronone was using these teeth as a kind of primitive filter, trapping small prey in the interdental spaces while water flowed out. The prey would be caught by the teeth and by thick gums that may have had protobaleen or at least thickened tissue that helped with filtration. This suggests that filter feeding began before teeth were lost, that the teeth themselves were co-opted for a new purpose, reshaped by natural selection to serve a filtering function rather than a grasping or tearing function. And then later, as baleen evolved and became more effective, the teeth became less necessary and were gradually reduced and eventually lost altogether. Another important fossil in understanding baleen whale evolution is Lanocetus denticrinatus, one of the largest early mysticaes. Despite having teeth, Lanocetus was already huge, about 8 meters long, approaching the size of some modern baleen whales. This is significant because it shows that whales were becoming larger before they fully developed filter feeding, before they had fully functional baleen. Size increase apparently preceded the evolution of elaborate filtering mechanisms, perhaps because increased size allowed these early mysticaes to take in larger mouthfuls of water and prey at once, made suction feeding more efficient, even without baleen. Once filter feeding with true baleen evolved, though, this trend toward gigantism would accelerate dramatically. Baleen whales would grow to sizes that dwarfed anything that had come before, would become the largest animals in Earth's history. But that was still millions of years in the future. In the Oligocene, in the time when these two great lineages were just beginning to diverge, baleen whales were still relatively modest in size, still figuring out exactly how to make filter feeding work most efficiently. The split between toothed and baleen whales was not instantaneous. It did not happen in a single generation or even in a single million years. It took time, millions of years in fact, for these two lineages to fully diverge, to develop all the distinctive characteristics that separate them today. There were many transitional forms along the way, whales that don't fit neatly into either category, whales that had some characteristics of one group and some of the other. The fossil record of this period, the early to middle Oligocene, is fragmentary, incomplete, full of gaps. But the fossils we do have paint a picture of experimentation and diversification of different groups of whales trying different strategies and seeing which ones worked. By the middle Oligocene, though, the two groups were becoming distinct. Toothed whales were pursuing individual prey and beginning to develop echolocation. Baleen whales were filtering small prey from the water and beginning to develop true baleen, and both strategies were proving to be wildly successful, allowing whales to diversify and spread and fill nearly every niche in the ocean. The odontocytes would eventually give rise to more than 70 species of modern toothed whales, from tiny porpoises to the enormous sperm whale. The mysticytes would give rise to the 14 or so species of modern baleen whales, including the blue whale, the largest animal ever to live on Earth. These two approaches to being a whale, hunting individual prey versus filtering small prey, would shape everything about how these animals lived. They would determine body size, diving behavior, social structure, migration patterns, feeding ecology. They would influence where whales lived, how they moved through their environment, what threats they faced, how they raised their young. The great divide between toothed and baleen whales is one of the most fundamental splits in mammalian evolution, as significant in its way as the split between carnivores and herbivores on land. And it all happened in the Oligocene, in the warm seas of 30-some million years ago, as the descendants of creatures like Dorodon began to explore new ways of feeding and new ways of living. The evolution of baleen whales, the Misty Set, is one of the most fascinating and remarkable chapters in the entire story of whale evolution. It represents a complete transformation in feeding strategy, a radical departure from the ancestral condition of hunting large individual prey, and it would eventually give rise to the largest animals ever to exist, creatures that dwarf even the biggest dinosaurs in terms of mass and bulk. But that endpoint was still far in the future. In the Oligocene and Miocene, baleen whales were just beginning to figure out how filter feeding worked, just starting to develop the adaptations that would make them so successful. As we've already discussed, the earliest mystices, forms like Mystacodon and Lenacitus, still had teeth. These were not the baleen whales we're familiar with today, not the toothless giants that cruise through Antarctic waters gulping krill. They were smaller, more primitive, still working out the best way to feed. Some, like Lenacitus, were probably still biting and chewing their prey much like earlier whales, using their teeth in fairly conventional ways. Others, like Coronodon, were beginning to experiment with filter feeding, using their teeth to trap small prey while expelling water. But gradually, over millions of years, baleen began to appear. The first baleen was almost certainly very different from what we see in modern whales. It probably wasn't the long, flexible plates that can reach 4 meters or more in right whales. It was probably much shorter, stiffer, less elaborate. It might have been more like thickened gums or short bristle-like structures growing from the roof of the mouth, rudimentary compared to modern baleen, but still useful for capturing prey more efficiently than teeth alone could manage. Even this simple primitive baleen would have provided an advantage. It would have allowed the whale to capture smaller prey, to exploit food sources that toothed predators couldn't access effectively. Small fish, krill, other zooplankton. These organisms are individually tiny but collectively abundant. If a whale could capture thousands or millions of them at once, could process vast quantities of water to extract this food, it could access a resource that was effectively unlimited, a bounty that could support much larger body sizes than individual predation allowed. One of the most intriguing transitional forms in baleen whale evolution is a creature called Archaeocetus, which lived in the late Oligocene about 25 million years ago. Archaeocetus is remarkable, extraordinary even, because it had both teeth and baleen, both systems present at the same time in the same animal. Fossilized skulls of Archaeocetus show grooves and pits and holes in the upper jaw, anatomical features that in modern baleen whales provide blood supply to the baleen plates as they grow. These features tell us that Archaeocetus had baleen, had those keratinous plates hanging down from its upper jaw. But Archaeocetus also had functional teeth, teeth that show wear from use, teeth that were clearly still serving a purpose in feeding. How did Archaeocetus feed? How did it use both teeth and baleen together? This is speculative, obviously. We can't observe extinct animals feeding, but it probably used a combination of methods depending on what prey was available and what was most efficient in a given situation. It might have used its teeth to grab and hold larger prey items when those were available and worth pursuing. Fish, squid, things that needed to be bitten and held. But it might also have used a form of filter feeding, using its baleen to strain smaller organisms from the water, taking in mouthfuls of water and prey, and using both its teeth and its baleen to process the catch. This flexibility, this ability to use multiple feeding strategies, would have given Archaeocetus a significant advantage. It wouldn't have been limited to one type of prey or one set of conditions. It could adapt its behavior to whatever food was most abundant, most accessible, most profitable at any given time. This kind of opportunistic feeding is common in modern animals and was probably equally common in the past. Over time, as baleen became more effective, as the plates became longer and the bristles became denser and the whole system became more efficient at filtering, teeth became less and less necessary. Natural selection would have favored whales with better baleen and could afford to have smaller teeth, because those whales could filter more efficiently, could consume more food in less time, could access prey that other whales couldn't catch. Eventually, teeth disappeared altogether in the Mystacid lineage, not in one dramatic step but gradually, generation by generation, becoming smaller and smaller until they were lost entirely or retained only as vestigial structures that never erupt through the gums. Interestingly, the fossil record suggests that the loss of teeth and the development of elaborate baleen happened somewhat independently in different lineages of mystacids. Some groups lost their teeth earlier, before developing extensive baleen, relying on thick gums or very primitive baleen for filtering. Other groups kept their teeth longer, only losing them after baleen was already well developed. This indicates that the transition to filter feeding was not a single linear process, but rather a series of parallel experiments, with different groups of whales trying different approaches, some more successful than others. One whale that illustrates this diversity of approaches is Maya nesbiti, discovered in Oregon and described in 2018. Maya is remarkable because it had no teeth at all, completely toothless, but it also didn't seem to have well-developed baleen, at least not the elaborate baleen of modern mysticates. So how did it feed? The best hypothesis is that it used its gums, thick and possibly reinforced with cartilage, to filter prey, perhaps specializing in soft-bodied organisms like jellyfish or small fish that didn't require elaborate filtering structures to capture. Maya shows that there were multiple pathways to filter feeding, multiple ways to solve the problem of extracting small prey from water, and not all of them involved developing elaborate baleen, at least not initially. The evolution of baleen also required changes to other parts of the whale's anatomy beyond just the mouth. The skull had to become wider and flatter to accommodate the baleen plates, which needed space to hang down and needed to be supported by robust bone structures. The mouth had to become larger, much larger, to take in the enormous volumes of water necessary for efficient filter feeding. Modern rorquals, the group that includes blue whales and humpbacks and fin whales, can take in more than 60 tons of water in a single gulp, their throats expanding like enormous balloons to accommodate this intake. This required major modifications to the throat, including the development of pleated skin and specialized muscles. The tongue also had to change, had to become more muscular and mobile to push water out through the baleen while retaining prey. In modern baleen whales, the tongue is enormous, can weigh several tons in large species, and is capable of generating tremendous pressure to expel water efficiently. And the whale's metabolism had to change to support the enormous energy demands of filter feeding, which involves processing huge volumes of water and extracting relatively small amounts of calories from each mouthful. These changes didn't happen overnight. They accumulated gradually over millions of years, each one a small modification that made filter feeding slightly more efficient, slightly more productive. Skulls became a bit wider, mouths opened a bit larger, baleen plates grew a bit longer, throats became a bit more expandable. Each generation was only slightly different from the previous one, but over thousands of generations, over millions of years, these small changes added up to create whales that were fundamentally different from their ancestors, whales specialized for a completely new way of feeding. And as these anatomical changes occurred, as filter feeding became more and more efficient, something else began to happen. The whales began to grow, slowly at first, but with gathering momentum, because filter feeding, once it's perfected, can support much larger body sizes than individual predation can. A toothed whale is limited in size by how much prey it can catch and process individually. But a filter-feeding whale is limited only by how much water it can process, how much food it can strain from that water in a given amount of time. And in the rich, productive waters of the world's oceans, especially in polar and temperate regions, where seasonal blooms of plankton are incredibly dense, there's enough food to support truly enormous body sizes. But that gigantism, that evolution of truly massive whales, was still millions of years in the future. In the Oligocene and early Miocene, mysticates were still relatively modest in size. Most were no larger than modern dolphins or small whales, perhaps 5 to 10 meters long. Nothing that would make you gasp in astonishment. The giants would come later, much later in the Pliocene and Pleistocene, when changes in ocean circulation and climate created ideal conditions for filter-feeding whales to reach truly colossal proportions. For now, in the early days of baleen evolution, these whales were still finding their place in the ocean, still experimenting with different body plans and different feeding strategies. Some of these experiments succeeded and gave rise to modern lineages. Others failed, ended in extinction, left behind only fossils to mark their brief existence. But together, these early baleen whales laid the foundation for everything that would come after, for the evolution of the largest animals ever to exist on Earth. For most of whale evolutionary history, for the first 45 million years or so, after Pakitus first ventured into the water, whales were not particularly large animals. The early whales, the Pakitistids and Ambulocitids, were the size of dogs or seals, a few meters long at most. The basilosaurids, including the impressive Basilosaurus with its serpentine body, were longer than most modern whales but not as massive, not as heavy. Even the early baleen whales of the Oligocene and Miocene were relatively modest in size, comparable to modern dolphins or small-toothed whales, nothing that would make headlines or inspire awe. So when did whales become giants? When did they grow to the astonishing sizes we see in modern baleen whales? Sizes that dwarf the largest dinosaurs that ever lived. The answer, surprisingly, is very recent. Studies of the fossil record, careful measurements of ancient whale bones from different time periods, show that the evolution of extreme gigantism in baleen whales occurred within just the last 3 million years. In geological terms, that's yesterday. It's a blink of an eye. And before that, even the largest baleen whales were smaller than modern humpbacks or grey whales, and nothing approached anywhere close to the size of a blue whale, which can reach lengths of over 30 meters and weights exceeding 150,000 kilograms. So what changed 3 million years ago? What happened that allowed and encouraged baleen whales to grow to such enormous sizes? The answer lies not in the whales themselves, but in the oceans, in the climate, in the way energy and nutrients flow through marine ecosystems. Around 3 million years ago, the Earth entered a series of ice ages, periods when ice sheets expanded across the northern and southern poles, when global temperatures dropped significantly, when ocean circulation patterns shifted in response to changing temperatures and the formation of glaciers and ice caps. These ice ages had profound effects on the oceans, effects that rippled through entire ecosystems. Cold, nutrient-rich water from the deep ocean was brought to the surface by changes in ocean circulation, by upwelling and mixing driven by temperature gradients and wind patterns. These nutrients, especially nitrogen and phosphorus and iron, are limiting factors in ocean productivity. Where they're abundant, phytoplankton bloom in enormous numbers. Where they're scarce, ocean productivity is low. The climate changes of the last few million years created conditions where nutrients were more readily available at the surface, where phytoplankton could access them and grow explosively. And where there is phytoplankton, there is zooplankton, the small animals like krill and copepods that feed on phytoplankton. And where there is zooplankton in abundance, there are baleen whales ready to filter them from the water. But the key to understanding the evolution of gigantism is not just that food became more abundant. It's that food became seasonally concentrated in specific areas, particularly near the poles and in upwelling zones. During the summer months in polar regions, the melting ice edge triggers enormous blooms of phytoplankton, which in turn support massive concentrations of krill and other zooplankton. These seasonal feeding grounds are so rich, so productive, but they represent a resource almost unimaginable in its abundance. For a baleen whale, this seasonal bounty presents both an opportunity and a challenge. The opportunity is obvious. If you can reach these feeding grounds, you can consume vast amounts of food in a relatively short time, enough to sustain you for months. But the challenge is equally clear. These feeding grounds are far from the tropical and subtropical breeding areas where whales give birth and nurse their young. A whale would have to travel thousands of kilometers, sometimes 10,000 kilometers or more, traveling for weeks or months without feeding, to reach these distant feeding grounds. And then it would have to make the return journey again without feeding, to reach the warm waters where it could safely give birth. Only large whales can make these journeys. Small whales simply don't have enough fat reserves to fast for extended periods. They need to feed regularly, daily or at least weekly, or they'll starve. But large whales can store enormous amounts of energy in the form of blubber, that thick layer of fat beneath their skin. A large baleen whale can build up blubber reserves during the brief feeding season that will sustain it through months of fasting during migration and breeding. The larger the whale, the more energy it can store, and the longer it can go without feeding. There's another advantage to large size for long-distance swimmers. The energy cost of swimming doesn't increase proportionally with body size. A whale that's twice as large doesn't use twice as much energy to swim the same distance. In fact, due to various physical and physiological factors, larger animals are often more efficient at traveling long distances than smaller ones. This means that a large whale can migrate farther on a given amount of stored energy than a smaller whale can access more distant feeding grounds, can exploit resources that smaller whales simply cannot reach. This created a positive feedback loop that drove the evolution of gigantism. Whales that were larger could migrate farther and could take advantage of the richest seasonal feeding grounds, the ones in polar regions where upwelling and ice edge dynamics created unparalleled productivity. They could consume more food during the brief summer feeding season, could store more energy as blubber, could survive longer fasts during migration and breeding. These larger whales were more successful reproductively, had more offspring that survived to adulthood, passed on their genes for large body size to the next generation. And over time, over hundreds of thousands of generations, this selective pressure drove body size upward, generation by generation, until baleen whales reached the enormous proportions we see today. The largest whale ever to exist, as far as we know, is the blue whale. Individuals can reach lengths of 30 meters or more, and can weigh over 150,000 kilograms. That's heavier than 30 elephants, heavier than almost any dinosaur that ever lived, heavier than almost any other creature in Earth's history. And this enormous size is made possible by filter feeding in productive polar waters, by the ability to consume truly vast quantities of krill during the brief summer feeding season, by the ability to store that energy and use it to fuel long migrations to distant breeding grounds. But size comes with trade-offs, with disadvantages and vulnerabilities that smaller animals don't face. Large whales need more food to survive, which means they're entirely dependent on those seasonal blooms, on the productivity of polar waters. If the blooms fail, if environmental conditions change in ways that reduce krill abundance, large whales are at serious risk. They can't easily switch to alternative food sources or move to different areas. Their entire lifestyle, their entire ecology, is built around those seasonal concentrations of prey. Large whales also face challenges with reproduction. Pregnancy in a blue whale lasts almost a year, and the calf that's born is already 7 meters long and weighs thousands of kilograms. The mother must nurse this calf for months, producing hundreds of liters of milk every day, milk that's incredibly rich in fat, to help the calf grow rapidly. This enormous investment in reproduction means that blue whales can only reproduce every few years, can only have a few offspring over their lifetimes. This makes populations slow to recover from disturbances, whether those disturbances are natural or caused by human activities. Despite these challenges and trade-offs, the evolution of gigantism has been a wildly successful strategy for baleen whales. It has allowed them to dominate the oceans in a way that no other marine mammal has achieved, to become the largest animals in Earth's history, to become icons of wildness and nature that capture human imagination across cultures and continents. Imagine a blue whale in the Southern Ocean, swimming through icy waters near Antarctica. It's summer here, and the sun barely sets, circling the sky in a long, slow arc that brings barely a few hours of twilight before rising again. The water is cold, just a few degrees above freezing, but the whale doesn't feel it. Its thick blubber insulates it perfectly, keeps its body temperature constant despite the frigid water. The whale has traveled here from subtropical waters thousands of kilometers away, a journey that took weeks of continuous swimming, weeks without eating anything at all. But now it has arrived at the feeding grounds, and the water here is thick with krill, so thick that it turns the ocean a reddish-brown color. There are millions of krill per cubic meter, countless trillions in the water column, a biomass so enormous that it defies comprehension. The whale opens its enormous mouth and lunges forward, accelerating despite its massive bulk. Its jaws spread impossibly wide, wider than seems physically possible, and it takes in tens of thousands of liters of water along with countless krill. Its throat expands like a balloon, the pleated skin stretching to accommodate the enormous intake. The whale looks almost grotesque for a moment, its throat distended, its body swollen, and then it closes its mouth and begins to push the water out, using its massive tongue to create pressure. The water flows out through the baleen, streaming from the sides of the mouth in great cascades, but the krill remain behind, caught by the dense bristles of the baleen, accumulating in the mouth. When all the water is expelled, when only krill remain, the whale swallows. The krill slide down into its stomach, thousands of them, kilograms of food in a single mouthful. And the whale will repeat this process hundreds of times today, thousands of times over the course of the summer, consuming tons of krill, building up the blubber reserves that will sustain it through the lean months ahead. This is the culmination of 50 million years of evolution, from a small deer-like creature wading in an ancient river to the largest animal ever to exist. It's a story of gradual change, of adaptation and innovation, of life finding ways to exploit every available niche, every possible food source. It's a testament to the power of evolution, and to the incredible richness and productivity of the marine environment. The giants of the deep remind us of what evolution can achieve, given enough time and the right conditions. They also remind us how fragile even the largest and most impressive creatures can be. Baleen whales today face threats that their size cannot protect them from. Ship strikes kill dozens every year. Entanglement in fishing gear causes slow, agonizing deaths. Ocean noise from shipping and military sonar interferes with communication and navigation. And climate change is altering the very oceanographic conditions that made gigantism possible in the first place, potentially reducing the productivity of the polar waters where these giants feed. But there is hope as well. Conservation efforts have brought some whale populations back from the brink of extinction. International agreements protect most species from commercial hunting. Marine protected areas provide safe havens, and growing awareness of the importance of whales to ocean ecosystems is translating into action, into policies and practices that might allow these giants to continue their reign in our modern oceans. The story of whale evolution is not over. It continues today as whales adapt to a rapidly changing world, as humans learn to share the oceans with these magnificent creatures. And so we come to the end of our journey, a journey that has taken us back through 50 million years of time, from the shores of ancient rivers to the depths of modern oceans, following the transformation of whales from land-dwelling mammals to the giants of the sea. We began with Pakitis, a wolf-like creature that waded in shallow streams under warm Eocene skies, hunting fish in the brackish waters where rivers met the sea. We watched as its descendants grew more comfortable in the water, more adapted to an aquatic life, generation by generation becoming more streamlined, more efficient, more at home in the embrace of the ocean. We met Ambulocetus, the walking whale still tied to land but spending more and more time in the sea, its webbed feet and powerful tail propelling it through estuarine waters as it hunted prey that its terrestrial ancestors could never have reached. We followed the protocetes like Rhodocetus as they ventured into open ocean, leaving the safety of the shore behind, crossing vast distances and hunting in waters where their ancestors would have been helpless. We marveled at Basilosaurus, the serpentine predator that ruled the Eocene seas, its long body undulating through warm tropical waters, hunting anything it could catch, including other whales, and we swam alongside Dorodon, the smaller, more typical early whale whose body plan would be the template for all whales to come, whose descendants still fill our oceans today. We witnessed the Great Divide, the moment when the whale family tree split into two main branches, toothed whales pursuing individual prey with the help of echolocation, and baleen whales filtering vast quantities of tiny organisms from the water. We traced the evolution of baleen from its humble beginnings in whales like Artiocetus that still had teeth, through various transitional forms to the elaborate filtering systems of modern mystices. And finally, we explored the rise of giants, the evolution of gigantism in baleen whales driven by climate change and seasonal productivity in polar waters, culminating in the blue whale, the largest animal ever to exist on Earth, a creature so enormous that it defies imagination, yet lives still in our modern oceans. Each step of this journey was a chapter in one of evolution's most remarkable stories, a story of persistence and adaptation, of incremental changes accumulating over unimaginable spans of time, of life finding new ways to exist and new forms to inhabit. It's a story that reminds us that nothing is fixed, that everything is in motion, that life is always evolving, always changing, always exploring new possibilities. As you drift off to sleep tonight, let these images fill your mind. Warm, ancient seas, where the first whales learned to swim. The graceful undulations of Basilosaurus, moving through clear tropical water. The patient filter feeding of early baleen whales. The migrations of modern giants across vast ocean basins, following ancient pathways inscribed in their genes by millions of years of evolution. These are not just stories of the past, they are stories that connect us to the deep history of life on Earth. Stories that remind us of our place in the vast tapestry of existence. We are relative newcomers, our species barely 200,000 years old, a fraction of a second in geological time. But whales have been in the oceans for 50 million years, have watched continents drift and climates change, have survived ice ages and warm periods and everything in between. The whales are still here, still swimming, still singing their songs in the darkness of the deep. They carry within them the legacy of their ancestors, the memory of that first tentative step into the water so many millions of years ago, and they continue to change, to adapt, to evolve. The story is not over. It continues even as you rest, even as you dream, even as the world turns and the tides ebb and flow. Sleep well, knowing that the oceans are alive with these ancient giants, that they move through their world with the accumulated wisdom of 50 million years of evolution, that they are survivors and thrivers and living testaments to the power of adaptation. Rest in the knowledge that this story, like the slow turning of the tides, continues on. The journey that began with a wolf-like creature in an ancient river continues today in every whale that swims, in every dolphin that leaps, in every gentle giant that filters krill from polar waters. Good night, and may your dreams be filled with ancient seas and swimming things, with the quiet persistence of life finding its way, with the wonder of evolution's endless journey from land to sea and back again, over and over, for as long as life exists on this blue planet we call home.